What up, YouTube? Today we're going to be going over the dreaded plastic intake coolant leak 4.6 liter problem on this Lincoln Town Car. Let's get started. Alright, so here we are getting started. I'm going to go ahead and get started with the basic stuff, removing the air cleaner, getting the belt off, getting the alternator off, and all of that good stuff. Air filter, I'm just going to unclip the top half, unplug the mass airflow sensor. There is one bolt or nut right here that holds this air chamber silencer deal on. And then there's two clamps, of course, so I'm going to start with that. I guess I should mention we're doing the intake gasket because we've got a coolant leak. You can almost hear it. And then when I squeeze the hose, it stops. Crazy. I decided not to mess with the sensor, just took the clamp off there. And then there are two hoses here that just need to be pulled out of the snorkel, this and this. Then of course pull it off the throttle. And then now we'll probably work on taking the throttle off, and there's a lot of linkage and connections and stuff going on to that, so I'm going to start getting some of that removed. Alright, over here on the throttle, this piece, as you can kind of see, it just slides up and off of that, and then the other cable goes in this slot, and you have to move it up like that, and there's a small slot in the bottom there. And that is how you're going to be able to slide this cable out. Dirty side goes outward. Then this spring, the hook, needs to be disconnected from right here. And then also went ahead and took the two bolts out as well. You can take this spring off if you want so you don't lose it. There's also a little piece of rubber inside of here that works like a silencer, I believe, to keep it quiet. So don't lose that either. And then we can kind of move this throttle assembly up and out of the way. Also, on the back here, there is a bracket that holds those throttle cables, and I've lifted it up, but it's got another bolt somewhere that I can't see, so I'm going to work on figuring that out. And we're also going to spray this down with PB Blaster and loosen that nut for the EGR tube, so we can hopefully remove the throttle body in as big of a piece, or as many components removed at one time as possible, instead of taking off every little piece one at a time. Alright, next I went ahead and unplugged all of these hoses. There's one here, there's two at the EGR, there's an electrical connector here, there's a vacuum hose here that routes under the fuel line, there's another one that goes to the fuel rail, and then this one comes around, and I popped it off right here. You can just barely see where it goes, right here where my finger is. That's the DPFE sensor, I believe. Alright, so I finally found the other bolt hole. It's right back there. I took this hose right here off to give myself a little bit more room. And then it kind of sits in there just like this with those two holes. And then the throttle cables are supposed to be connected to it, but mine were kind of loose. I think they're supposed to slide into these. So I'll go ahead and make sure that that's back the way it's supposed to be. But now we got a little bit more room to get at this EGR nut. And then there is a coolant hose here that needs to come off. And I already disconnected the throttle position sensor, as well as the idle air control. You can kind of see the connector there. So we're moving right along. Alright, so we went ahead and used a little bit of PB Blaster and a wrench, an adjustable wrench, and a really long extension with a big socket on the end of this ratchet, and that was able to break it loose. Your results may vary, because I've seen those get extremely stuck before, but luckily mine came off fairly easily. And then I went ahead and slid the coolant hose off as well, but I think I snapped the clamp, so I'm going to have to replace that at some point. But now I think we can take these 4 8mm bolts off of the throttle assembly, and then this whole thing should come off at this point. So there's actually a 5th bolt that connects to this little tail on the throttle body there, so don't forget that, and we should be able to pull this whole thing out of there now. Now that looks like a much more manageable intake job. So I think we're going to go ahead and take the alternator off next, and this upper radiator hose. We'll have to disconnect that. We'll get all the bolts out of this alternator bracket. There's another bracket that holds the throttle cables right here. Looks like just 1 bolt. Wouldn't be surprised if there was another one. Then I'll probably go down and unplug all my fuel injectors and all my ignition coils on each side. Alright, so I got the belt off using a 3/8 drive in the tensioner and pushing it towards the driver's side. Took the 410mm out of the alternator bracket. Had to tape this back on because it broke on me. That goes into the alternator bracket. Then I also got the connector unplugged. You just lift up on this tab and it slides up. And we want to take this boot off. And there is a 10mm nut right there. And of course I did disconnect the negative battery cable. So I'm going to take that 10 off here and these 2 10s on the bottom. I would also recommend leaving your belt routed across everything other than the alternator. So we'll take this out and we'll keep moving. Alright, now we got the alternator out. You can kind of see some more evidence of this coolant leak I got going on in here. And with the alternator, you can just loosen these bottom bolts. You don't have to take them out all the way. The alternator ears have kind of holes cut out of the bottom, so you can just lift it up. If this bracket was still installed and you were only going to replace the alternator, you would want to take these out all the way, but since we had enough clearance, I just left them in there. We're not going to be taking anything apart any lower than this anyway, so I just left those in place. Now I'm going to go ahead and get to these coils and injector. So I went down the line and unplugged each ignition coil and injector, and you just want to try to pull that wiring back as much as you can. And then on this stud right here is this wire that just pushes on and pulls off. I assume that's a ground of some sort. We got this one unplugged as well. Same thing on the other side. Got them all unplugged. So now I'm going to take this bolt out of this bracket, and then I'm probably going to take this cap off, and then we're going to push down on the valve a little bit so that we can relieve some of the pressure, because I didn't do that beforehand. And then we're going to have to use a special tool. You want to pull this off with your hand first, if it will cooperate. There we go. Pull that off. And then there's a spring inside here that we need to get at with a special tool. Many of you guys may have already seen that. We're going to go ahead and push that spring in with a special tool, and this line will pop off. But I want to relieve some of the pressure first. Then we should be able to remove what appears to be 1, 2, 3, and probably 4. It comes up right out of that hole there. So there's 4 nuts and studs that hold the fuel rail on, and then we want to be careful pulling up on the injectors. It's probably a good idea to replace the injector O-rings as well, but we'll see what those look like when I get it out. Okay, so we finally got this bracket off, and that's actually one of the intake bolts, believe it or not. And then down in here, you can kind of see that empty threaded hole right behind the injector. There's actually a bolt that goes in from the back side, or it's a stud and a nut, but the stud ends up coming out with it. And finally we got that out. These wires back there actually hold on to it, and of course the little clip broke on that too. I got that right here, so I can't really get to it very easily. But once the intake is off, I should be able to tape that back on a little easier. It's probably not a big deal that it's not there at all, but it's my car and I want to make sure that I don't screw it up as much as I can. So anyway, Now we're going to go ahead and disconnect the fuel line here, and then take the 4 nuts off that hold the fuel rail on. Alright, so for this fuel line, you're going to want to get a tool set kind of like this one, and then you pull whichever size off you need, and then this part here that my finger's on is actually going to go in from right to left into this area, and it's actually going to go, this cylinder part is actually going to go under the circular spring, and it's going to spread that spring out, and that's what's going to enable us to pull this line off. Now it also helps to push the line from left to right as you're pushing the tool from right to left, and that'll help get the spring disengaged. Alright, so we've got our fuel line disconnected here. I tucked it over right here. And we got the 4 bolts out, and then I took a long door panel tool and very, very carefully pried up all the way around. So now we should be able to basically lift this entire assembly up out of the vehicle. Alright, so I took my shop vac and I went in these areas by the injectors, and I blew everything out. Well, actually I vacuumed as much out as I could, and then I switched the vacuum and I blew out all the dust and debris just to try to prevent anything from going down into the intake ports once I pull that off. Then I also took off the upper radiator hose, and I think the only thing left is this heater hose. And then there's another one back there, and they both go to the firewall there. And I think even though they're not bad, because they're such a pain in the ass to get to, I'm probably going to go ahead and replace those heater hoses while this is off as well. Alright, I took the 2 bolts out for the thermostat housing because they go all the way through into the head. I got the heater hose off. Hopefully your clamp on your heater hose is oriented in such a way that you can get it off a little easier. There's mine. And then I've got all the bolts out. So now we should be able to, oh boy, I just cracked the shit out of that. Anyway, we're supposed to be able to lift this up. Might be a little difficult, but I've got all the bolts out. And this is what it looks like with it off. You can definitely see that coolant that leaked down in the valley. And that looks like where it failed right there. You can kind of see this gasket right here sticking out a little bit. Looks like it kind of did a similar thing on the other side, but I do believe these are the original gaskets. I need to check the intake as well and make sure that it's okay, but I'm pretty sure we found the culprit here. Well, shit, guys. I think we're probably gonna need the damn intake too. Look at that crack. And then on the other side, we got an even worse deal there. That plastic is gone right there. I mean, it's just gone. That shit's never gonna seal with a gasket alone. So we're gonna definitely have to replace this. And I'm not getting that Dorman intake, because that Dorman piece of shit makes you lose a whole bunch of horsepower. Also, my little noise canceling deal has fallen apart, but that's not a huge surprise. But due to the way that that coolant port looks and the way that that one looks, I do not feel super comfortable about reusing this. And unfortunately, I feel like whatever is gone from right here is probably in the coolant system somewhere. So hopefully that doesn't cause any blockages. I guess tomorrow we're going to pick up a new OEM Ford intake. Well, we got the heads cleaned up pretty well. Got the valley cleaned out to the best of my ability. It still looks a little bit moist, but it's not, you know, filled with water or coolant or whatever. Vacuumed out all the intake holes just in case with my crevice tool on the shop vac. And there was a little bit of coolant in this spark plug hole here, so I went ahead and vacuumed that out as well. And here we have this new intake from Ford. And just a heads up for any of you guys that are doing that, I did buy the OEM Ford intake to avoid doing a Dorman, and unfortunately the revised Ford intake is actually not too different from the Dorman. You cannot get the original one from Ford anymore unless you somehow can find a new old stock. So I did a little research, found a video, and they did a dyno on all three intakes. The original one has the most horsepower, and then this one you're going to lose about 10 horsepower, and the Dorman you lose about 20. So I would rather have a genuine Ford part. I did buy this directly from the dealership, says FOMO Co. And then, I guess that's not it. Yeah, right there you can see the sticker right there from Ford. So unfortunately it's not the same exact intake. It was a revised one. They told me that at some point these went on back order and there was so many failing that they made a revised version of it, but unfortunately it does come with a slight power loss. And I'll of course do a couple of test runs in the car just to show you guys what I think about the power, if anything, when the job is complete. Also, that cover that went on the bottom of the original intake went right in the trash. You put a little bit of pressure on it and it crumbles to pieces, so screw that thing. So we got the intake placed and some of the bolts in there, a thread or two by hand, got the thermostat and gasket in place. Alright, so we got all the bolts tightened down, thermostat housing on, and this actually tells you, like, here's 9, here's 6, 2, 4. It tells you the order to tighten the bolts in, and it gives you the torque specs right there as well. And then we got the heater hose connected here. It's moving right along. Alright, next thing I did, I went ahead and cleaned off all 8 ignition coils, 6 of which are still factory original on this car. And then they come with all new bolts, 8mm instead of 7. I'm a fan of that as well. Moving on to the next step. Alright, so I went ahead and wiped down all the fuel injectors real good, wiped down the fuel rail, gave it a little spritz with some throttle body cleaner, brake cleaner, whatever, just in the screens, make sure there's no BS in there. And ideally you would replace all the fuel injector O-rings as well as those heater hoses while you're doing this job, and maybe plugs and coils too. I just did my plugs, I don't need any coils at the moment. Heater hoses I could not get today because my auto parts stores can oftentimes be unreliable. And same with the O-rings, I was only going to be able to get 8 of them instead of 16, and I don't see the sense in doing half of them, so I'm just going to put these back on. Hope they don't leak, but they are really clean. We're going to lubricate them a little bit before we put them in. Next, I went ahead and plugged in all the injectors and the coils. Don't forget this little ground wire right here that just pushes onto the stud. I've also screwed in the coolant temp sensor, plugged it in, as well as this connector here at the end of the fuel rail. And then there's a cap here on this new intake that I have to tighten down. I put a little thread tape on that. And then all of these coils and injectors are plugged in as well. So next I cleaned off and reinstalled this bracket. There is a 15mm nut and stud on the back, and I find that it's easiest to come in this way around the top of that wiring harness to get to it. I don't know if this will help you guys at all, but this light. But I came in from this way to get at it. I don't know if I can get my phone in where you can see it or not. Probably not, but it's down there. And then we got this one tight as well. This is actually your number 3 for the intake bolts as well. So when you go through your torque sequence and tighten them down, you're going to be skipping number 3. Had to bust out the hood light because it was getting a little dark out here, but we got the alternator reinstalled. The 2 bolts on the bottom that we left loose. And then these 4 bolts for the alternator bracket, the 2 connections for the alternator, and then the stud for the fuel rail holds that line in place there. And then we also got the upper radiator hose reinstalled. Damn clamp broke on me, so I had to struggle getting that off, but we got a new clamp on there. On to the next step. Alright, so I went ahead and reinstalled this vacuum assembly. We got it in here at the fuel rail. We got it in here at the fuel rail. And then we got this back connection plugged in as well right here. We got the throttle body assembly on. I still have to put these two hoses there. This hose goes here. I have another hose that goes from here to the PCV valve. You will have to use one of the threaded self-tapping screws that's provided in the kit for the throttle body on this car specifically. And then I've got to connect this right here. Make sure it clicks in a sec, and then I got to tighten up the bolts for this as well. A couple other connections and we'll be pretty close to done. So I went ahead and put this bracket back on, and that's two of the self-tap screws that comes with it. But unfortunately, I needed a third one back here. You can just barely see that bolt hole for the end of this bracket. They did not provide that, but all this bracket does is hold the throttle cables into it back here. And I think as long as it's not rattling or something, then it's probably fine with the one bolt. And if it is rattling, I'll find another one of those screws to put in later, but I think it'll probably be all right. All right, so now we got everything with the throttle assembly back together. All electrical connectors, vacuum hoses, throttle cables reconnected. We got that spring back on. And now I just have to put the air intake duct back on, which these two will plug into. And then it connects right here on the engine cover, and that should be pretty much it. All finished up, gave her a little wipe down. That air chamber that comes off of the air tube here with the stud and the 11mm, you'll have to take that stud off of the old intake and install it as well, so don't forget about that. Now I just got to add coolant and make sure it isn't leaking. Go on a test drive, make sure that it still accelerates all right and it didn't lose all its power. We got it running, we got the coolant level in the cold fill range. Got the heat on full blast, just letting it run till it reaches operating temperature and that new thermostat opens. Then we might have to add a little more coolant and we'll probably take it on a test drive, but so far so good, no obvious coolant leaks, and the heat is working. Well, I'm out here driving it around, and I can honestly say that I don't really notice too much of a power loss. So if there is a power loss, it's probably just by numbers alone, because there's really not much of a noticeable difference here. We'll do a little acceleration, and it's a little bit, I don't want to say it's sputtering, but I think there was a little bit of coolant and a little bit of that cleaner that I used on the head inside the cylinder that needs to burn off fully, but seems to be running good now. That's going to be the end of the video for today, guys. Hope you all enjoyed. Hope you learned something. Kind of sucks that I had to get a whole new intake instead of just replacing the gaskets, but it does look a heck of a lot cleaner. If you liked the video, please leave a like below. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to help you out if you leave a comment below. And then also, if you have not already, please consider subscribing to the channel. Otherwise, this is Andy signing out.